This is Dr. Rand Oman, and it's good to be with you again. And this is a number, this is number 15 in a group of videos that we have been doing on the Human Freedom Project. And this has been an exciting project to be on. I've been on it for a good bit of my life, and we've talked about that in previous sessions. And it's about the book that I have written. I am going through it one bit at a time, trying to help you to understand. I love to teach, and this is part of my teaching. And I love my God. I have learned to love myself. And I love the people that I'm talking to, whether they be clients or others, because I have a message from God that is really important, and He wants me to get that across to you. So I hope that the teaching is affecting your life in a way that it's very endearing to you and very deep and very understandable, and it's changing your life. I know it changed mine, what I've done, and that's why I'm so behind this. I have a passion for God and a passion to get His word out. So I do want to remind you, though, the name of the book is Rebuilding the Wounded Heart, God's Plan for the Restoration of the Soul. So last time we were talking about the boardroom. We were talking about the fact that the boardroom is a place that God has, actually the boardroom is the outer case, or the outer dimensions of the boardroom is basically your crania. And the boardroom table is your brain. And so as Christ sits as we talked about last time, Christ comes into the room and He sits at the head of the table, and He is the chief executive officer and president of your corporation, which is your brain. He has made that brain intricately, and He deals very strongly with the different parts of your brain, but also the many truths that He wants to put into it. And the autonomic nervous system is basically what He works through. The autonomic nervous system is the brain and the vertebrae. And out of that vertebrae comes a bunch of branches of nerves that go to each of our major organs. And as that happens, Satan can also counteract that and use the same approach. He can use our autonomic nervous system too, and he does. And he does it quite effectively without our even understanding that it's happening. So we have to understand that we begin a lot of things that are painful to us physically, but spiritually, mentally, emotionally, every other way, all begin in the mind. Everything begins in the mind, and it goes from there. Even the sexual part of us, it all begins in the mind, in what we think and what we do, and how we think about things. When we are going to school, it all starts with our mind. That's why Jesus says to put on the mind of Christ. It is my understanding, and I mentioned this in the last session, it is my understanding that the different parts that sit around the table, and we haven't talked about that yet, but the different parts that sit around the table are in different parts of the brain. I am working with the Lord and trying to understand that at this point. And as I said last time, I will let you know when I finally come to the end of what I'm studying. But it's a really interesting subject, and I think I'm going to work with a doctor friend of mine to see if we can figure that out. We both have gone through this process. We both are, well, he's a board member, and I trust him very much, and I think between the two of us and maybe a few others, we get together and we'll pray about it and we'll get to the bottom of it. But until that time, let me explain more about the parts that come into the room. So God has put these parts in different parts of the brain. So as they come into the room, they're absolutely sitting at a part of the brain that he has put them in. And so the right side of the table is right brain. That's usually creative, that's usually intuitive and emotional. The left brain is more cognitive, more into the math and science and logic and philosophy. Well, not so much philosophy, but somewhat. But the left brain is more linear, and the right brain is more curvilinear. And so as we look at the table and we see Jesus at the head of the table, the next thing we do is we have the host walk in. And so the host will walk in, and the host is the person, like in my case, like I said last time, is basically a little more than 76 years old, because it's the 9 months before birth at the time of conception to the total years that you've lived, because the host has been through all the experiences that you would experience in a lifetime. So the host will walk in. They'll see the host walking in. Obviously, we're in the spiritual realm at this point. And it's interesting where the host will sit. If it sits next to Jesus, there's a very close relationship with Jesus. If the part sits at the opposite end of the table, that means there's a distance going on. Proximity, when it comes to the parts that walk into the boardroom, is very important, and it tells me a lot before we even get started. Because if there's a whole bunch of parts that are on the opposite end of the table of Jesus, what does that say about intimacy? It doesn't say much. It says there's distance. If there's a whole lot of parts that are close to God, then that means there's a lot of intimacy, and a lot of times I don't run into too many of those. Usually there's distance, and there's some parts that stand against the wall because they don't think that they belong at the table. There's some parts that stay outside the room because they don't feel worthy. And so as we progress, so first of all, the host comes in, and then the parts are an interesting thing because they can be at any age. Like in my case, I had a 3-year-old part, a 6-year-old part, and a 12-year-old part, and an 18-year-old part, and a 31-year-old part, and they all have a reason. They have a reason to be there. A lot of it is developmental stages, and we all know about development. Well, I don't know if we all do, but there's stages of life where certain things are needed for us to be the complete person that we're supposed to be. And all of us have some problems with developmental stages. We don't reach exactly where we are to be because those developmental stages are interrupted. So in my case, at 3 years old, I was abused. And I was abused by an uncle. I might have said that before. I don't know. I can't remember. But that's a nurturing stage. And at 3 years old, your mind is not developed enough to really understand that your parents didn't, understand it was happening. And so they didn't protect me, but if they don't know, how can they protect me? And so there's a lot of that goes on in these situations. So at 3 years old, I was being abused, and I didn't feel nurtured. And the rest of my life, I have been finding ways to be nurtured. And it's not been healthy because I didn't accept that particular age. That particular age 3 has been with me for all these years. Do I seek nurturing as much anymore? No. But one of the major ways that I saw it nurturing was in sports. I was pretty much good at anything I tried. Did I always win? No, but I was intense. But I was intense because I had to be the best so that I could get a pat on the back and say, good boy, basically. And that's what nurturing does to us. People who are alcoholics are looking for nurturing. Something, I'm not saying it's totally this, but something has happened at an earlier age. especially in this age 3. And it makes people always looking out for somebody to pat them on the back. It's the easy way to say it, and say, hey, you're a good boy or a good girl. So there's so many aspects of life that are played out because you have a 3-year-old part that's not hasn't been nurtured, and you may be 21, and you may be 41, you may be 60, you may be, whatever age, but that 3-year-old is still there causing you to want to be nurtured. When you finally learn, and that's the reason for working with these parts, is you learn that there's strongholds that have kept you the way you are. And when you find out about that and get rid of them, and God delivers you from them, then you can finally let that nurturing desire go. And so Satan puts strongholds on you at that age that would necessitate you're moving more towards nurturing instead of having the nurturing of God. So as you become free, you become nurtured by him. And as you become nurtured by him, then you become free. So each part that you have that God has given you needs to be nurtured. All right, at age 6, that's the developmental stage where you need to learn how to trust. And I never trusted anybody because this abuse just was ongoing for 9 years till I was 12. And so I have always had a problem with trusting people. Actually, God has taught me that we shouldn't trust too many people anyway, because we live in a world that we better find out about these people and ask God if we can trust them. So when it comes to clients, I will ask the Lord, should I work with this person? And if he says yes, then I trust the person, that they're not out to get me. So people who have been abused are always expecting somebody to perpetrate against them, and they're always a victim in that sense unless they get freedom. So what I've also learned is, because this world is flawed, there's a lot of people you can't trust. So if you trust in God and you depend on him and say, should I trust this person? What about this book? What about this video? What about this podcast I'm listening to? I always ask him, and if he says don't look at it, I don't look at it. I mean, it takes a little discipline. It takes very little time. But by hearing the voice of God, we can ask those kinds of questions of God. And I had a prophecy placed over me in 2002 that said I would be asking all kinds of questions. Well, this kind of work necessitates asking a lot of questions. And in this sense, at age 6, I have a 6-year-old part and a 3-year-old part now. Then we moved to 12. And during all this time, I was living life, but I was living it dissociating. I didn't know I had these two parts. So I basically had a reasonably decent childhood, but there was always something nagging at me, and there was always something that made me feel worthless. I was constantly feeling worthless, even though I was achieving in many ways. I was an excellent cornet player. I was good in sports. I liked to read. And yet I was never happy. Definitely not joyful. But I'd only be happy for brief bits of time when I really achieved. And so moving to 12 years old, that's when the abuse stopped. My grandma lived up the tracks, and I'd walk up there. It was only half a block away. There was tracks between our houses. She lived on the next street over. I lived on the opposite side. And I'd go up there, and she would go and have coffee with her friends when I was up there, but my uncle was living in the house, and he was running a business out of it. And so when she was gone, he would take advantage of me. And obviously, he would warn me not to tell anybody, and so I didn't. In fact, at that time, I didn't even remember that I had been abused. I didn't remember I was abused. I dissociated so well that it wasn't until after I started doing this kind of work, when I was 52 years old, that I had dreams for 6 months. I didn't tell my wife because they were embarrassing dreams. They were homosexual dreams. They were dreams of somebody abusing me. At first, I thought it was my dad, but then I saw the face, and it was my uncle. And that's when I really started getting into this work, is because I needed help myself. And I finally got it. And that's what this is all about, is helping people. And because I have been abused myself, I know and are sensitive and empathetic towards people who have been abused. I've obviously worked through it. It's not an issue anymore. God says to put those things behind you and press on to the goal of the higher calling in Christ Jesus. And there are many of you that are like me out there, many more than I would like to think. And to get the freedom you need, it would be good to complete this process. So as we continue to talk about the 12-year-old, when I was 12, I remember how angry I was. And that's what happens when we get abused. We get very angry. And I was so angry that I was out to get everybody. Didn't trust anybody, was angry, was isolated. I isolated myself. Would I play with the kids in the neighborhood? Yeah, superficially, but I stayed away from anybody on a deeper level. I continued to do that for a number of years. And so when I became 14, I was on the football team. I was the smallest player. I could hit hard, but I wasn't much. I was 89 pounds. They had to go out and buy me a uniform. But the coach said to my dad at the end of the season, he said, he hits as hard as anybody on the team, but he's too small. I'm afraid to put him in the game. He'll get hurt. I mean, there's guys twice my size playing against me. And so I became a football manager in the following year because they wouldn't let me play. I was too small. But I was angry, and that's why I hit so hard. It felt so good. I don't know that I'd want to do that anymore, but at that time there was something I needed to just get out of me, and that was it, but I didn't know what it was. I did poorly in school. I probably graduated, I think we had 660 students in our graduating class. I was over 600 something. D minus. I didn't realize it, but I was smart enough to pass every class. I knew how to manipulate. But there was something wrong because my parents were both intelligent persons, but I thought I was stupid and not worth much. I went through all the way through high school, and I couldn't get into any college. Back in my day, there was a couple colleges, and they were called Parsons College and Mankato State College in Minnesota, one in Iowa and one in Minnesota. And I understood that they would take anybody. Well, they wouldn't take me. So that's how badly I did in high school. Then I worked for the same uncle that abused me. And that same uncle was never nice to me. But he let me work for him for driving a truck, stocking shelves, that kind of thing. For the year that I stayed out of school, and I said to myself, I don't ever want to have to do this again. So I tried to get into school. I got into Trinity College on probation. And God gave me an 18-year-old part. That 18-year-old part could do the work, even though I hadn't really studied before. I got straight B's for 4 years with playing tennis, basketball, doing all kinds of other things, working. And I still got straight B's, and I didn't really put much effort into it. So that 18-year-old, it's very interesting. He's the one that's talking to you right now. He's the one that reads. He's the one that studies. He's the one that teaches. That part of me has been invaluable to me in business and in the counseling arena and as a teacher originally. So I went on, taught school for 4 years, And then I asked this same uncle, at that time I didn't remember that he'd abused me, if I could leave my teaching profession and come and work for him and learn as much as I could from him so I could eventually take over his business. Because he was 72 at that time. Well, I did that. And for 4 years, when he was 76, he passed away suddenly. And eventually my aunt was to give me $150,000 loan, which was quite a bit back in 1976. And I paid that off in a year and a half, which was good. But God gave me, which I did not recognize, a 31-year-old part that could just do business. It was automatic. It was just, I knew the right decisions to make, but I never gave him credit. And see, that's how parts work in us. And if we don't get those parts delivered, we are going to have a problem in our lives, and we'll never get to where we need to be, even though we appear to be successful. So that's all I can say today, and I hope you get something out of what I'm saying about parts and the host and how Jesus needs to be the CEO. But we're going to have to stop there for today, and we will start up again next week from where we left off today. But remember this, if the Son frees you, you will be free indeed. So goodbye, and God bless in Jesus' name.